He's the most cited author in the world, and he's both revered passionately and reviled passionately. We're talking about Karl Marx, Marxism, in the context of the model of a participatory economy on this episode of PEP Talk.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Hello, and welcome to PEP Talk, the Participatory Economy Podcast, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as a participatory economy. I'm your host, Mitchell Szczepanczyk, coming to you from Chicago, and I'm joined by Robin Hahnel. Robin, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be with you.
The topic of this podcast episode can be potentially very heated. The topic is Marxism in relation to a participatory economy. And the topic of a couple of things at the outset I should mention here. One is that the topic of Karl Marx and Marxism can be very heated. The goal in this episode of PEP Talk would be to try to bring more light and less heat to the discussion. So that's our goal here. Second thing is with regards to the experience, with regards to the life and work of Karl Marx, I will give at the outset, I am far from being an expert on the topic. I read a summary of the Communist Manifesto for my high school history class as an assignment. It was a summary of the Communist Manifesto. I also saw the Howard Zinn play Marx in Soho. And that's about the extent of my experience with Karl Marx, even though I've got a lot of experience regarding radical political economy. And full disclosure, I contributed to a book that Robin had written, and we've worked together for many years. I don't have a whole lot of experience regarding Karl Marx or Marxism. But Robin, you do. But before we get to that, let me just first ask, the topic and the subject matter regarding Marxism can be very heated, but also very unclear. So let's get some terms down. We'll start with Marxism. What do you mean by Marxism? What do people mean by Marxism? Define the term, or try to.
Well, part of the problem is it depends on who you ask what they would say Marxism is, or what Marxism is to them. We know Karl Marx was a man. We know that, he lived in the 19th century. We know what his writings are, although there's actually, a good deal more to be said about his writings than one would first think, because many of his writings were seriously edited by, his collaborator, Friedrich Engels. And some parts of his most famous writings were actually put together by Engels after Marx died. So we know something about the man, and certainly, people who've spent a lot of time studying Marx, thinking about Marx, and people who call themselves Marxists have done a certain amount of to a certain degree, they know who he was. The other thing we know is that in the history of socialism, there's no name that stands out as more important. And I don't think there's any doubt that he is a great intellectual figure of our time, that like very few others, I would say like Sigmund Freud, like Charles Darwin, he has changed humans' understandings of ourselves and the universe we live in, as much as anybody else has. He would be mentioned in a very small handful of people who have contributed as greatly as he has to our understanding of ourselves, the societies that we create, how they operate, et cetera, et cetera. But then, of course, you have I have many friends who call themselves Marxists. I have many friends who have called themselves Marxists and now would not necessarily do that. And usually what that comes down to is, well, what part of Marx do you still ascribe to, use in your work, and what parts do you no longer? Because Marx wrote a lot on a lot of subjects. Amongst Marxists, you go from people who are, I would say diehard disciples, to people who will say, oh, of course I've studied Marx. I would call myself a Marxist. These are the great insights, that I have gotten from Karl Marx, and that's why I still call myself a Marxist. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Marx had a theory of history that goes under the name of dialectical historical materialism. So this is a theory of how it is that human history has evolved and what drives, changes in human societies. So one can essentially, I know amongst academics that for people who are sociologists or historians who call themselves Marxists, that's the part of Marxism, that they find very insightful. On the other hand, he also, wrote actually 6 volumes of an analysis of capitalism. He not only wrote Das Kapital, which is 3 volumes, he wrote something called Theories of Surplus Value that's very, much less read. That's 6 huge volumes where he is developing an analysis, of capitalism and its dynamics. And he also used what was very popular. What was common to almost all economists at his time in the 19th century, he used something that, has been called a labor theory of value. What is it that actually gives value to different goods? Well, it's the amount of time it took people to make them. That's what makes some of them more valuable or less valuable. Or when we think of what does it cost to make things? Well, it costs people's hardworking labor time. And so he developed a formal economic model to explain prices, profits, and rents in capitalist economies. And he used the tool at the time that was available to him, which was called the labor theory of value. Adam Smith used the labor theory of value. Karl Marx used, David Ricardo used the labor theory of value. Karl Marx used the labor theory of value. Part of what he thought he had done was he had modified it and changed it a little bit to explain things better that he was very proud of. But in any case, different people who call themselves Marxists basically take different parts of Marx, as the reason that they would self-identify as Marxists. The other thing I want to say at the outset is that, and I'll go back and talk about my own relationship to Marxism in a minute. I just want to say that there are people who were once diehard Marxists, and who most of these people at some point joined some sort of radical political organization, or usually a Marxist-Leninist sect or movement or organization of some kind. And many of these people recanted. They sort of said, oh, yes, at one point in my life, I believed in Marx. At one point in my life, I thought that capitalism was evil and should be, replaced by socialism. But I no longer believe any of that. That was an error of my youth. So there's a number of figures who are anti-Marxists, or who have essentially recanted. I was once a Marxist. And I no longer am. And if I describe myself here at some point as somebody who was once more of a Marxist than I am now, I want to make very clear it's not in that sense. I certainly consider Marx to have been one of the greatest intellectual figures of all time. I think he had more insights about capitalism and why it is that humans should replace capitalism with socialism, than anybody else I can think of, in all honesty. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of things about Marx and the tools that he used that we can now move on, that we have found better tools, and that we don't need to hold slavishly to exactly how he did things when tools that were not available to him, have become available.
There's still the issue, though, about, I guess, what makes Marxism and what makes someone a Marxist. I could, even though I haven't done this, read all the books of Karl Marx and then take a test, and then I would get a card saying I'm a Marxist. I mean, I guess, would it be that simple, or is there just some other matter with regards to some particular set of beliefs regarding what Karl Marx wrote? I thought it was like there was a quote I remember hearing that Karl Marx himself said, "I am not a Marxist." You know anything about that?
There is a famous quote, and I think, I mean, that quote's very interesting because what had happened, even while Marx was alive toward the end of his life, was that various people calling themselves Marxists were running around and denouncing everybody else who thought anything a little bit differently about their version of Marxism. And Marx himself got kind of disgusted with that. He realized this isn't very useful. And sort of his way of making the point that this had gone way overboard, and that, you know, that he did not endorse it, was to say in a very provocative way, you know, I am not a Marxist. I'm still a thinking person, you know, who weighs things and weighs arguments and doesn't come to the decision in advance because this is the Marxist answer.
What's your experience regarding the works of Karl Marx?
Well, okay. So at this point in my life, I have many Marxist colleagues and people who, you know, write about socialism who call themselves Marxist and are Marxist. And frequently I find myself being dismissed as somebody whose views on the subject of what are better ways to organize socialist economies. I find myself being dismissed as, well, he's not a Marxist. And I find that rather interesting. Because unlike yourself, as you explained, I'm very familiar with Marx's writings. I first read Das Kapital, all 3 volumes, when I was living in Panama, and I read it in the Spanish language edition in Spanish. And my Spanish is not as good as my English, and it meant I had to read it slowly. And I always thought, you know, I've really read it probably more carefully because I had to go more slowly than many others I knew, you know, who read it in English. After that, I went to a PhD program in political economy at American University. And the PhD program had a track called the political economy track. And one of our PhD graduate classes that went for the whole year, it was a 2-semester class, was a class in political economy in which we read. And I also, I mean, the title of the first book I ever published was called Unorthodox Marxism. Unorthodox Marxism says, here is a version of Marxism that is trying to essentially take the essential parts that are still useful and accurate, but recognizing that in the year that was published in 1978, that certain things have been learned, you know, that Marx could not possibly have known when he died in the 1880s. So the idea of unorthodox Marxism is let's sort out the wheat from the chaff. Let's give the master his due, but let's also go and say which parts of what he did are no longer that useful and can be replaced by something that is more useful, and which parts of what he did are still incredibly insightful and we want to keep it as part of our way of thinking about things. So, I mean, that is my own experience with Marxism. Now, in all honesty, since 1978, if you ask me, have I come to feel that fewer parts of Marxism are useful, and that we now, with greater wisdom and knowledge and actually historical experience, I mean, I think Marx would have been shocked that capitalism recovered from the Great Recession in the 1930s. And had he lived through that, I think there's a decent chance that he would have wanted to relook at some of his theories. I think if Marx had lived through the period, if he had lived in the 20th century and saw what happened when the Soviet Union tried to create a post-capitalist socialist economy, I think he would have been very surprised by that. I think in his eyes, once capitalism was overthrown, particularly by a powerful revolutionary movement that wanted to build socialism, that it would be relatively straightforward to go about building a very highly desirable and highly productive socialist economy. And I think if he had lived long enough to see what happened in the Soviet Union, that would have changed his attitude about how easy is it going to be for the associated producers to create a desirable socialism once they get, once the yoke of capitalism is lifted from their shoulders. So in many ways, I think that Marx himself, would think somewhat differently, had he lived through historical experiences that we have now lived through, and we can learn from that. And my attitude is, well, yes, we need to continue to keep learning. But it is true that the last book that I wrote on this subject was called Radical Political Economy, Sraffa versus Marx. And it was my attempt to say, look, in particular ways and in particular areas, we really have some intellectual tools that were unavailable to Marx. My favorite one is the Frobenius-Perron theorem. So there's a theorem in mathematical economics called Frobenius-Perron. It's about matrices. And my own belief is that not just Marx, but David Ricardo as well, they used the labor theory of value to try and understand and explain prices and profits, because that was the only tool that was available to them at the time. The Frobenius-Perron theorem wasn't proved until the early 20th century. Well, once you have that theorem, certain technical problems are more easy to solve, and their solution turns out to be a little different than what Marx had hypothesized using inferior mathematical tools that were the only ones available to him in his era. So I continue to honor who I call Grandfather Marx as one of the greatest intellectual figures ever, in a category with Darwin and Freud. But I just think that slavishly continuing to use his tools and only his tools, and refusing to sort of recognize that history has now shown us that some of the things that he believed or he predicted or he hypothesized would happen, that didn't happen, and different things happen instead, that we need to learn from those experiences, and we need to figure out what we now have some better tools and what we can replace. So it's always a process, I think, for all great intellectuals. What do you keep? What still continues to be the wheat, and what was the chaff? And an honest intellectual discourse is one that's always continuing to reevaluate, and continuing to go ahead and upgrade.
And I suppose, as the topic of a lot of your work over the last 40 odd years, and the topic of this podcast, the Participatory Economy Podcast, you co-invented the model that has since been called the participatory economy. What are the ties that you see between Karl Marx's work and the work regarding what the model that we call a participatory economy? What do they have to do with each other?
Well, I'm going to think about it this way. What do I think Marx would think about our model and proposal for a participatory economy? I'd actually never asked myself that question before. And so I'm thinking out loud here. And my first reaction, I think he'd like it. I think he'd like it a lot. He would certainly like the fact that we believe that workers should manage themselves, and they should enjoy the fruits of their own labor without having somebody steal part of it as profits and boss them around and not let them decide how they want to go about work. I think all of that would be something that was very much a part of Marx's vision of this desirable, post-capitalist economy. that he favored. And I also think the fact that our own model highlights a great deal of autonomy for workers in their own workplace over what they do, and does not essentially leave the decisions about what's done in workplaces to planning agencies or central planning agencies in particular. I think he would find that very attractive. I mean, here I am speculating about what Marx would think, what he would think about the Great Depression, what he would think about the history of the Soviet Union, what he would think about the alternative to capitalism that we now call a participatory economy. And God knows if he came alive, I have no idea, what he would really think. But certainly my own understanding of what he envisioned to be socialism, I think in many ways our model is sometimes more consistent with his own desires than some of the other models that are out there. Certainly on the subject of markets, I mean, Marx was an incredible critic of markets. Mm-hmm. I mean, he had a very deep criticism of markets, and it wasn't just sort of their sort of more mundane failures. He had a whole theory called commodity fetishism, and he said in market economies produce in people a kind of false consciousness in which they somehow they see these commodities exchanging for one another at different prices, and they don't understand these exchanges are really just disguising human relationships behind this. So one of the things that people who now propose models, post-capitalist models that are market socialist models, I think those people, when they try to lay claim to Marx as somebody who would approve of their post-capitalist, proposals, I think they have to stretch Marx very, very far, very, very hard. And I don't think I have to stretch Marx nearly as hard, to imagine that he would be supportive of a participatory economy as people have to stretch Marx, to argue, Marx would be in favor of different versions of market socialism that are out there today.
By saying you stretch Marx, it seems like trying to infer what he would think on a given topic based on what we know about what he wrote. Is that what you mean?
Yes. There are hundreds and hundreds of pages and major parts of Marxian theory that are criticisms of markets. Mm-hmm. And I think you have to make a very strained misreading of Marx to imagine that he would have, that if you showed him a market socialist model and said, and that's the alternative to capitalism that you always thought, would be the desirable, aftermath when capitalism is gone, I think you really have to stretch things. Mm-hmm. The other thing that Marx is actually well known for, I mean, anybody who's a Marxicologist, and as much as I've read of Marx, I do not count myself as a Marxicologist. There's a consensus amongst Marxicologists that for a variety of reasons, and that's where they can argue with one another, but what they agree on in terms of Marx's relationship to socialism is he didn't write a lot about it. Everything he wrote was about capitalism. And everything he wrote was about how it is that human societies evolve from feudalism to capitalism and then will evolve to socialism. But he didn't talk about socialism. I mean, he which was not uncommon. If you go to look at writers in the 19th century, almost all of them thought that once capitalism was abandoned, that the building of socialism would be relatively straightforward and everybody would understand how it should work and it would work just fine. Mm-hmm. And I think actually that's one of the areas in which Marx has been proved unprophetic. that the common assumption, both that he made and almost everybody else in his era who was a critic of capitalism made, that if you overthrow capitalism, then it'll be relatively clear what it is that should be, it should be replaced with, and what it's replaced with will be relatively problem-free and non-controversial. I think that's one of the things we have learned from history, that Marx was probably a little off on.
There's one point, and kind of touching on a couple of points that we've raised in this discussion, and I'd like to get your thought on this. You very briefly mentioned Charles Darwin and his great book, The Origin of Species, which began a lot of the modern analysis regarding biology, was published in 1859. But biology has come a long way since 1859. And that's not to dismiss, Charles Darwin's work at the time. He did what he did with what he had at the time, given the tools of his era and the state of knowledge of play. That's basically what any of us can do, given what we've got. We try to improve things with what we have now. But biology has come, you would think, a long way since then. A lot of the questions and a lot of the flaws regarding what Darwin had written in 1859 has been improved upon and corrected upon. You would think that the field of political economy would do the same thing with regards to the 19th century works of Karl Marx or any political theorist of that era. You take from prior work and bring into it, trying to improve it, trying to expound upon it, trying to fix problems that we're seeing. But yet it seems like Marxism doesn't really do that. It seems like it's less a science and more a faith or a religion. That's my read of it. It seems like less of a kind of a serious pursuit of, some kind of scholarly endeavor like a science. What's your take on this? Am I off base here? What do you think?
Well, I have two reactions. So let me. One of them is that I would make this analogy that Darwin's theory of evolution, we've learned a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
And actually rather recently, now that we can essentially map, look what we can do with DNA analysis now.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so there's a tremendous amount of scientific progress that has occurred. And it almost makes you wonder, how the hell did he figure all that? He figured out the essential right answer, and he didn't have this evidence. Right. He didn't have this tool. And I would make the same argument, for instance, with respect to linear algebra and the Frobenius-Perron theorem and the labor theory of value as now being outmoded. And new technology, gives us a better systemic way of understanding and explaining. And I'd like to think that if Marx came alive today, he would look at all that and say, oh my God, you're right. I struggled with some things because I didn't have those tools. And with those tools, it all straightens out in I'd love to believe that would be his reaction. It's the reaction that any honest scientist should have. Now, the other thing that I think the other issue that's sort of interesting is progress in the hard sciences, does it operate somehow differently than what we might call lack of progress in the social sciences?
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that the social sciences are often more encumbered and in a debilitating way by human interests and people essentially making arguments that the analysis and the theories are used to justify different roles that different groups of people play. And while there are vicious debates that go on between people who work in the hard sciences, there are competition between physicists and competition between chemists and biologists, which in terms of academic competition and sort of rivalry, probably as great as there are amongst social scientists, historians, sociologists, etc. But I do think that in the social sciences, there's an extra element that has meant that it's not just evidence, what becomes accepted theory and what becomes abandoned theory is not always determined by the strength of evidence, and in particular, the arrival of new evidence. I think that's the scientific method works better in the hard sciences, and unfortunately, there are things that make it work that have made it work less well in the social sciences. And this is, of course, a particularly this is an area that's highly politicized, and therefore I think that we suffer from that.
I've been speaking with Robin Hahnel. This has been PEP Talk, the Participatory Economy Podcast, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as the participatory economy. In this particular episode, we've been discussing Marxism in relation to a participatory economy. To find out more about the Participatory Economy Project, which makes PEP Talk, visit the website of the Participatory Economy Project at participatoryeconomy.org. There you can visit a website, join a forum where you can raise questions regarding Marxism and political economy or any topic related to a participatory economy. You can also sign up for a regular monthly newsletter where you can find out latest developments regarding the Participatory Economy Project. This is Mitchell from Chicago. I've been joined by Robin in Portland. Thank you very much for listening or watching. Bye for now.
Bye for now.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Self-management, democratic control of communities or workplaces, federal arrangement.
Participatory democratic planning.
Jobs to have a mix of empowered work, nested councils linked to one another. Everyone gets to participate in a primary council.
Please visit participatory.economy.org to find out more and subscribe to our newsletter. And don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks, and see you at the next episode.